A lonely house in the English countryside holds a terrifying title. For decades, the name Borley Rectory has been synonymous with the supernatural, branded the most haunted house in England. Picture a dense fog clinging to the Essex fields, and through the gloom, the stark silhouette of a Victorian rectory, its windows dark and empty. This is where our story begins, not with a single ghost, but with an entire cast of phantoms. By the end of this journey, you will unravel the century-old mystery that sits at the heart of this legendary case, a tangled web of eerie sightings, controversial investigations, and unexplained fires. We will meet the families who fled in terror, the flamboyant ghost hunter who made it famous, and the skeptics who tried to tear the legend apart. Was this place a genuine portal to the other side, or one of history's most elaborate hoaxes? What does it truly take for a story to become a haunting? The story of the most haunted house in England begins not with a ghost, but with a quiet decision made by a church. In the mid-1800s, the parish of Borley was a deeply rural corner of Essex, a landscape of scattered farms and ancient lanes far from the growing industrial cities. It was a place of solitude where the silence was broken only by the wind and the distant lowing of cattle. The spiritual needs of this small, isolated community were served from Borley Hall, a charming but aging manor house that had long doubled as the local rectory. Yet by the 1860s, church authorities decided the old hall was no longer suitable. A proper, purpose-built home was needed for the parish rector and his family. So, in 1862, construction began on a new building just across the road from the ancient parish church. The commission went to a local architect named Henry Dawson, who designed a solid, red brick Victorian house. It was large, with more than 20 rooms, but it was not a Gothic mansion. It was a functional family home for a country clergyman, built with practicality, not grandeur, in mind. The first man to call it home was the Reverend Henry Bull, who moved in with his family in 1863. For over 30 years, the Bulls lived there in apparent peace. Reverend Bull was a respected figure, a keen gardener who even built a summer house in the rectory grounds. Those first decades were quiet, ordinary, and entirely free from any public talk of phantoms. The bricks and mortar were new, but the land they stood upon held centuries of history. This ordinary beginning makes everything that followed so much more strange. How does a house go from a quiet family home to a national spectacle of fear? The first whispers of an answer began not with the new rector, but with his children. Yet even in that quiet beginning, the land itself seemed to hold a memory. The Reverend Henry Bull and his wife raised 14 children in that sprawling rectory, filling its many rooms with the sounds of a bustling Victorian family. For years, life carried on with a familiar rhythm of lessons, prayers, and games in the garden. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, a different kind of presence began to make itself known. It started with small, unsettling sounds that defied explanation. Family members would hear the distinct sound of footsteps pacing the empty hallway outside their rooms, a steady, solitary tread that would stop as soon as a door was opened. The servants' bells, which hung in the kitchen and were connected by wires to different rooms, would sometimes ring on their own, summoning staff to vacant parts of the house. These were the sorts of things a busy family might dismiss as the odd noises of an old house or the pranks of numerous children, but then the sightings began. Several members of the Bull family at different times reported seeing the figure of a woman in the rectory garden. She was always described the same way, a tall, mournful figure dressed in the dark habit of a nun. Witnesses said she would walk a specific path near the summer house, her head bowed, as if in prayer or deep sorrow, before vanishing into thin air. This was no fleeting shadow. It was a recurring, detailed apparition that became an accepted, if unnerving, part of life at Borley. To explain this spectral nun, the Bulls reached for a local legend that had been passed down for generations. The story went that long before the rectory was built, a Benedictine monastery had stood somewhere on the grounds. According to the tale, a monk from this monastery and a nun from a nearby convent fell in love. Their romance was of course forbidden. The legend diverges here. Some versions say the two tried to elope but were caught. Others claim they met a far darker end. The most common conclusion was that the nun was walled up alive within the convent walls, or that both lovers were executed for their transgression. This tragic love story, whether rooted in historical fact or rustic folklore, provided a ready-made ghost. The family believed the sad nun pacing their garden was the spirit of that heartbroken woman, eternally searching for her lost love. For decades, these experiences remained just that, private family stories shared between relatives and perhaps a few close friends. The Bulls did not call for exorcisms or write to the newspapers. They simply lived with it, a strange secret in their otherwise ordinary home. This intimate, family-held phase of the haunting is crucial. It means the legend of Borley Rectory did not spring fully formed from the mind of a publicity-seeking investigator. It began with the sincere, repeated experiences of a respected local family who had nothing obvious to gain from inventing such tales. Their quiet testimony laid the entire foundation for everything that followed, transforming a house into a vessel waiting for a story. When Reverend Bull passed away in 1892, the rectory stood silent for a time, holding its secrets. But a new family was about to arrive, and they would find the nun was not the only restless soul in residence. The quiet family haunting of Borley Rectory was about to collide with the modern world of publicity. In 1929, a new rector arrived at the house, the Reverend Guy Smith, along with his wife. They knew the local stories, of course, but likely dismissed them as quaint folklore. Their skepticism did not last long. Almost immediately, the Smiths were plunged into a nightmare far more intense than anything the Bull family had described. They were bombarded by poltergeist activity, objects flying across rooms, mysterious ringing of the servant bells at all hours, and the terrifying sound of a horse-drawn carriage galloping up the drive at night, only for no one to be there. One evening, Mrs. Smith saw the apparition of the nun, clear as day, standing in the garden. They found a human skull wrapped in brown paper, and messages began appearing on the walls, scrawled in pencil. Frightened and overwhelmed, the Smiths reached out for help. Their call was answered by the most famous and most divisive ghost hunter in England, Harry Price. Price was not a somber academic or a clergyman. He was a showman, a self-styled psychical researcher with a background in journalism and stage magic. He understood the power of a good story. He had made his name investigating mediums and seances, often exposing frauds with a magician's eye for trickery. But he was also a true believer in the possibility of genuine phenomena, and he possessed an insatiable appetite for the spotlight. Borley Rectory, with its decades of eerie history and its new, terrified occupants, was the perfect case for him. He arrived with cameras, notebooks, and a flair for drama. Price's methods were a mix of the systematic and the sensational. He interviewed witnesses, took detailed notes, and tried to document phenomena. But he also invited newspaper reporters along, ensuring that every strange knock and phantom whisper was splashed across the national press. He immediately declared Borley the most haunted house in England, a title that stuck. For Harry Price, the rectory was not just a mystery to be solved, it was a stage, and he was determined to be its director. His fascination was immediate and all-consuming. He saw in Borley the ultimate proof of the supernatural, a case that could define his career and his field. But by bringing the bright lights of publicity into those shadowy halls, he irrevocably changed the nature of the haunting itself. The private family secret was now a public spectacle, and the story was only beginning to twist into stranger shapes. The Smiths' experience was a sudden and violent escalation. Where the Bull family had grown accustomed to a solitary, mournful spectre, Reverend Guy Eric Smith and his wife Mabel walked into a house that felt actively hostile. Their complaints were not of distant footsteps but of direct physical harassment. Stones were hurled at the windows from inside empty rooms. Keys would vanish from locks only to reappear in impossible places. The servant bells rang with a frantic, chaotic energy, as if the entire house was trying to summon them at once. The atmosphere was one of constant, unnerving intrusion. The breaking point came with a message. One evening, Mabel Smith was in the Blue Room, a space the family rarely used. She glanced into a small mirror on the wall and froze. Scrawled across its surface in faint, shaky handwriting was a plea. It read simply, "Light, Mass and Prayer." This was no random scrawl. It was a direct, coherent request from an unseen presence, a cry for spiritual help that chilled them to the core. For a clergyman and his wife, the implication was profound and terrifying. Whatever was in the house was not just lost, it was suffering, and it was asking them for a salvation they felt powerless to provide. They could no longer dismiss the phenomena as imagination or old house noises. Frightened and desperate for answers, they did something the Bulls had never considered. They contacted the press. Their letter went to the Daily Mirror, one of Britain's largest newspapers. The paper, sensing a sensational story, immediately dispatched a reporter. And that reporter, in turn, contacted the man he knew was England's foremost expert on such matters, Harry Price. With that single decision, the private haunting of Borley Rectory was over. The gates were thrown open and the world was invited inside. Harry Price's arrival transformed the story from a local curiosity into a national obsession. His initial investigation, covered breathlessly by the Mirror, confirmed every eerie detail and added new ones. He was the one who famously branded it the most haunted house in England, a title that would be reprinted in newspapers across the country. The Smiths, overwhelmed, did not stay long. They moved out after less than a year, their lives profoundly disrupted. But they had served as the crucial link, the terrified witnesses whose credible testimony provided the spark. Harry Price now had the stage, the audience, and a haunting that seemed eager to perform. And the next family to live in the rectory would find that the spotlight only made the phenomena grow stronger and far more personal. The rectory's new occupants would experience its fury firsthand. In 1930, the Reverend Lionel Foyster, a cousin of the Bull family, moved into Borley with his wife Marian and their young adopted daughter. If the Smiths had endured a bombardment, the Foysters walked into a full-scale siege. For the next 5 years, the house unleashed a torrent of poltergeist activity so intense and varied it remains one of the most documented cases of its kind. Objects did not just move, they were hurled with force. Stones and bottles flew through the air inside sealed rooms. A hairbrush once sailed across the bedroom and struck Lionel on the chest. Marian was frequently targeted, pelted by everything from pebbles to a heavy glass candlestick that materialized from nowhere, an occurrence known as an apport. Coins would suddenly drop from the ceiling, and the violent, insistent knocking on walls and doors became a constant, maddening percussion. But the most chilling phenomena were the messages. Pleas for help began to appear, scrawled on the walls in pencil or sometimes even etched into the plaster. They were desperate, fragmented cries. "Marian, please help get," one read. Another simply said, "Prayers." The messages often seemed directed at Marian herself, as if whatever force was at work saw her as a conduit or a source of sympathy. This personal connection fueled a compelling and controversial theory. Could Marian Foyster herself have been the unwitting source of the chaos? She was a young woman in a strained marriage, living in an isolated, oppressive house with a history of supernatural lore. Psychical researchers have long noted that intense poltergeist activity often clusters around individuals, typically adolescents or those under severe emotional stress, a phenomenon sometimes called recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis. The idea is not that the person is faking it, but that their own unconscious psychic energy might be somehow manipulating the physical environment. Was Marian perhaps unhappy or psychologically strained, acting as a human lightning rod for the rectory's latent energy, or were the events something else entirely, a deliberate performance? The sheer volume and variety of the incidents witnessed by Lionel, their maid, and even outside visitors like Harry Price, made simple fraud seem a monumental round-the-clock task. Yet the focus on Marian was inescapable. The phenomena seemed to follow her, to speak to her. This period pushed the haunting beyond ghost stories into the murky realm of human psychology, blurring the line between an external haunting and an internal one. Exhausted and terrified, Lionel Foyster finally reached out for help in writing, compiling a detailed record of the events in a desperate attempt to understand. He sent this account, known as the Foyster Manuscript, to the one man he thought could solve the mystery, Harry Price. The ghost hunter now had his most explosive chapter yet, and he was about to take control of the story in a way no one could have predicted. Harry Price returned to Borley Rectory in the summer of 1929, and he came prepared for a siege. His investigation was a spectacle of both science and showmanship, an attempt to capture proof of the paranormal on his own terms. He brought in teams of volunteer observers, often students or fellow researchers, to maintain a 24-hour watch in the house, logging every sound and shadow. They sat in the dark rooms with notebooks and cameras, listening for the phantom footsteps and watching for the apparition of the nun. Price himself conducted seances and planchette sessions, a precursor to the Ouija board, attempting to communicate directly with the entities he believed resided there. Through these methods, he didn't just confirm the existing stories, he expanded the haunting into a full cast of characters. He catalogued not just the sorrowful nun, but a headless man seen pacing near the church, a phantom coach and horses that would thunder up the drive at midnight, and even the spectral forms of the two young Bull sisters who had once lived there. His work created a taxonomy of ghosts, giving each phenomenon a name and a history, transforming random events into a structured legend. The culmination of all this work arrived in 1940, long after the Foysters had left, with the publication of his book, The Most Haunted House in England. It was a masterstroke of publicity, a dense, detailed, and utterly compelling account that presented Price not as a gullible believer, but as a meticulous researcher. The book was filled with photographs, floor plans, witness statements, and logs from his observers. It read like a scientific report on the impossible. For the public, this was the definitive proof. If a man like Harry Price, a known exposer of frauds, had written an entire book documenting the phenomena, then it must be true. The book did not just describe the haunting, it canonized it. It took the scattered family anecdotes, the newspaper reports, and the chaotic poltergeist events, and wove them into a single, authoritative narrative. Borley Rectory was no longer just a spooky old house. It was a certified supernatural landmark, thanks to the weight of a published volume. Yet this very authority is where the controversy truly begins. Price's techniques, for all their apparent rigor, were deeply flawed by modern standards. His observers were not impartial, they were often enthusiasts hoping to see a ghost. The seances and planchette sessions, methods now widely understood to be influenced by the subconscious mind of the participants, produced messages that conveniently fit the existing legends. Critics would later argue that Price, perhaps unconsciously, created the very phenomena he was trying to document. His presence, his expectations, and his dramatic retellings may have shaped the experiences of those in the house. The book, therefore, stands as a paradox. It is the primary source that made Borley famous, yet it is also the primary source that many skeptics would later dissect to challenge the entire legend. Price gave the story its permanent shape, but in doing so, he may have written the haunting into existence as much as he recorded it. The rectory itself, however, was about to deliver a finale so dramatic that not even Harry Price could have scripted it. Fire would finally consume the physical shell of Borley Rectory, but it would only fuel the legend. In February 1939, the house was occupied by a new tenant, a retired British Army captain named William Gregson. He was a skeptic, a man who saw the stories as nothing more than sensational fiction. His time at Borley was meant to be a quiet retirement in a large, affordable country house. That peace shattered on the night of February 27th. While moving an oil lamp in the library, Captain Gregson accidentally knocked it over. Flames erupted instantly, feeding on the old wood and draperies. The fire spread with terrifying speed, roaring through the hollow walls and up the staircases, turning the dark, silent rooms into an inferno. Local fire brigades rushed to the scene, but the rectory was isolated and the old well on the property had run dry. They could only watch, along with a crowd of villagers and reporters, as the most haunted house in England burned against the night sky. The structure was a total loss. By morning, only the blackened, skeletal brick walls remained, open to the sky, a haunting silhouette of its former self. It seemed like a definitive end. If ghosts were tied to a place, then the destruction of that place should have ended the story. But at Borley, the opposite occurred. Amidst the chaos of the fire, a reporter from the local newspaper claimed to have witnessed something impossible. As he watched the flames lick at the upper windows, he swore he saw the distinct figure of a woman in dark, nun-like clothing, standing motionless in a first-floor window, seemingly untouched by the blaze raging around her. He said the figure was there one moment and then gone the next. This account, published for all to read, was electrifying. The fire had not exorcised the ghost, it had seemingly summoned her for a final, dramatic appearance. The tragedy of the blaze now became intertwined with the supernatural narrative. Was the nun a spirit showing herself one last time as her home was destroyed? Or was she, as some later speculated, the cause of the fire itself, a final act of spectral rage? The ruins themselves now took on a new, potent mystique. The fire had stripped the house down to its bones, creating a perfect Gothic stage. Visitors to the scorched site reported feeling an even heavier, more oppressive atmosphere than before. Strange lights were seen flickering among the rubble at night. The phantom footsteps were now said to echo across the broken flagstones of the ground floor. The destruction had not ended the haunting, it had universalized it. The ghost was no longer confined to specific rooms. She now roamed the entire, open wound of the property. Captain Gregson, the accidental architect of this new chapter, was reportedly haunted himself by the event, not by ghosts but by the sheer, ironic weight of it. He had set out to debunk a myth and had instead, through a simple accident, authored its most iconic scene. The fire of 1939 transformed Borley from a haunted house into a haunted ruin, a setting that felt even more ancient and tragic. It provided a perfect, unanswerable question. How could so many people see a ghost in a window that was, at that very moment, filled with fire? This event cemented the legend in the public imagination in a way no book or newspaper article ever could. But as the smoke cleared over the Essex countryside, a new kind of investigator was already preparing to sift through the ashes, not for ghosts but for the truth. The smoldering ruins of Borley Rectory were not the end for Harry Price, they were his greatest opportunity. In 1937, with the house a hollow shell, Price did something extraordinary. He leased the property for an entire year. This was no longer a series of visits, it was a full-time occupation, a scientific siege on the supernatural. He installed a team of resident observers, often university students, who lived in a cottage on the grounds and maintained a 24-hour watch over the blackened walls and empty rooms. Their task was to log everything, every sound, every shadow, every chill in the air, creating an uninterrupted record of activity in a place that was, by all logical reasoning, dead. The vigil produced its usual catalogue of oddities, phantom lights, and unexplained footsteps in the rubble, but Price was after something more concrete. He wanted physical proof, evidence you could hold in your hand. His focus turned to the cellar, the lowest, darkest point of the house. It was there, he believed, that the secret of the nun might literally be buried. In March of 1938, he organized a formal excavation. With workmen and observers present, they began to dig up the cellar floor. The atmosphere was tense, a mix of archaeological solemnity and Gothic thriller. And then the diggers made a find. Amidst the clay and rubble, they uncovered fragments of human bone. Most significantly, they claimed to have found a woman's skull and a jawbone. For Harry Price, this was the smoking gun. He immediately connected the discovery to the local legend of the walled-up nun. Here, he declared, was the tragic heroine of the story, her remains hidden beneath the very house her spirit haunted. It was a perfect, almost too convenient piece of evidence. The discovery, however, was instantly mired in controversy. Critics pointed out that the excavation was not conducted by professional archaeologists, but by Price's own team. The condition and location of the bones were questioned. Could they have been much older, perhaps from a medieval burial ground that once occupied the site, unrelated to any 18th century love story? Or, in the darkest interpretation, was the entire find staged? Price vehemently defended his work, but the doubt was sown. To lay the matter, and perhaps the spirit, to rest, Price arranged for the bones to receive a Christian burial. In a quiet ceremony at Liston churchyard, a few miles from Borley, the skeletal fragments were interred in consecrated ground. It was a powerful symbolic act, a final attempt to bring peace. Yet, in typical Borley fashion, even this resolution sparked new mysteries. Some claimed the haunting at the rectory grounds grew quieter afterward, as if the nun had finally been laid to rest. Others reported that strange activity now began to occur near the new grave at Liston. The burial had not ended the story, it had simply moved it. This chapter represents the peak of Harry Price's ambition, his attempt to transition from chronicler to conqueror of the haunting. By finding the bones, he sought to provide the literal skeleton for his legend, to ground the spectral nun in physical reality. But by controlling every aspect of the discovery, from the dig to the dramatic conclusion, he also ensured that his greatest proof would forever be his most debated act. The question lingers, did he finally solve the mystery of Borley Rectory, or did he merely write its most compelling final chapter? The legend of Borley Rectory seemed unassailable, a ghost story backed by a book and cemented by fire. But every great myth eventually attracts its mythbusters. With Harry Price's death in 1948, the door finally opened for a cold, hard reassessment of his life's work. The task fell to the very organization that should have been his natural ally, the Society for Psychical Research. Founded in the late 19th century, the S.P.R. was dedicated to investigating paranormal claims with scientific rigor, and they had long viewed Price's flamboyant methods with deep suspicion. In 1956, they published a bombshell, a formal report authored by three of their most respected and skeptical members, Eric Dingwall, Kathleen Goldney, and Trevor Hall. Their investigation was not about finding ghosts, it was about investigating the investigator, and what they found shattered the official story of Borley into pieces. The trio's report was a meticulous 500-page demolition job. They pored over Price's original notes, interviewed surviving witnesses, and re-examined every piece of evidence. Their conclusion was devastating. They accused Harry Price of outright fraud. According to the report, Price was not an objective researcher. He was a showman who manipulated facts to create the perfect haunting. They pointed to the mysterious wall writings witnessed by the Foysters. While Price presented them as supernatural pleas, the investigators found strong evidence suggesting Marian Foyster herself had written them, possibly during states of psychological stress or even as a cry for attention within her troubled marriage. This didn't necessarily mean she faked all the poltergeist activity, but it stripped away one of the most chilling pieces of spirit communication. Then they turned to Price's crowning physical evidence, the nun's bones. The S.P.R. report asserted that the skeletal fragments unearthed from the cellar were not human at all, but likely animal remains, possibly from a butchered pig or sheep. They argued Price either knowingly misidentified them or, worse, planted them to create a sensational discovery. The report also dissected Price's famous year-long vigil in the ruins, suggesting his volunteer observers were often inexperienced, suggestible, and under his direct influence, their logs reflecting what they hoped to see rather than what actually occurred. In essence, Dingwall, Goldney, and Hall painted a portrait of Price as a man who started with a kernel of strange local folklore and, through exaggeration, selective reporting, and occasional fabrication, built it into the epic haunting he so desperately wanted to document. For many, this report was the final word. It reduced Borley Rectory from a paranormal case study to a case study in human deception, a cautionary tale about how belief can bend reality. The most haunted house in England, it seemed, had been haunted only by the ambitions of one man. Yet, as with everything at Borley, even this seemingly definitive debunking failed to lay the story to rest. But the most damning evidence in the skeptics' report focused squarely on a living person, Marian Foyster. According to investigators Dingwall and Goldney, Marian had privately confessed to them. She allegedly admitted that she had faked many of the phenomena herself, from throwing the bottles and stones to scribbling the mysterious wall messages. Her motive, they claimed, was startlingly human. She wanted to frighten her husband, Lionel, into moving them away from the isolated, oppressive rectory. If true, this confession unravels the entire Foyster chapter, transforming 5 years of terrifying poltergeist siege into a desperate, elaborate marital performance. It paints Marian not as a victim of a haunting, but as its ingenious, if troubled, architect. The lonely wife, trapped in a crumbling house with a history of ghosts, saw an opportunity in the legend itself and used it as a tool to change her life. This explanation is clean, logical, and utterly devastating to the paranormal claim. It suggests the heart of the Borley mystery was not a supernatural force, but a very human cry for escape. Yet, as with every twist in this story, the truth about Marian's confession is far from simple. Her statements over the years were wildly inconsistent. While she reportedly confessed to the skeptics, she gave other interviews where she vehemently denied any fraud, insisting the phenomena were terrifyingly real. She described objects materializing in mid-air and the palpable sense of an invisible, intelligent presence. So which Marian do we believe, the one who confessed under the rigorous, skeptical questioning of professional investigators, or the one who later seemed to recant? Critics of the SPR report argue that her confession may have been coerced or at least heavily led by investigators who were determined to find a mundane explanation. Faced with their authority and their clear desire for a certain answer, a vulnerable Marian might have told them what they wanted to hear, just to end the relentless questioning about the most traumatic period of her life. Her relationship with Lionel adds another layer of poignant complexity. Their marriage was known to be strained. Lionel was significantly older, and they lived in profound isolation. If Marian did fake some events, can we truly separate that action from the eerie backdrop of the rectory itself? Perhaps she started by playing a prank, only to find that the house or something within it took her small deceptions and amplified them into something genuinely unexplainable. This is the haunting possibility of a feedback loop between human psychology and place. A lonely, unhappy woman in a house saturated with ghost stories might unconsciously create a few strange events, but then the collective belief, the charged atmosphere, and the sheer history of the location could have sparked a genuine paranormal episode that far exceeded her initial intentions. Her human drama, her desire for attention or escape, may have been the kindling, but the fire that followed could have been something else entirely. Marian Foyster remains the most human and most enigmatic figure in the Borley saga, a reminder that the deepest mysteries often reside not in the shadows of a haunted house, but in the tangled shadows of the human heart. The haunting of Borley Rectory was never a one-ghost show. While the sorrowful nun became its tragic poster spirit, the house and its grounds accumulated a veritable menagerie of phantoms, each with its own distinct story. This expansion transformed the location from a simple haunted house into what some critics later called a ghost zoo, a crowded spectral stage where almost any eerie archetype could appear. The most famous of these supporting specters was the phantom coach. On countless nights, residents and visitors alike reported hearing the unmistakable sound of a horse-drawn carriage. It would begin as a distant rumble, then grow into a furious clatter of hooves and wheels, racing up the long, dark driveway towards the rectory. The sound would reach a crescendo right outside the front door, and then, with a sudden and absolute silence, it would vanish. No coach, no horses, no driver would ever be seen. This recurring auditory haunting suggested a moment frozen in time, perhaps the arrival of tragic news or a fateful visitor from the rectory's past, eternally replaying its dramatic approach. Then there were the visual apparitions, each more bizarre than the last. A headless man was frequently reported, often seen pacing near the old churchyard, his form solid and unmistakable except for the chilling absence where his head should be. In a strange twist of poetic justice, the ghost of the original rector, Henry Bull himself, was said to wander the grounds he once tended. Witnesses described a solid-looking figure in dark clerical clothing, sometimes seen sitting in the summer house he had built, as if still keeping watch over his problematic legacy. Two other phantoms rounded out this peculiar cast. A young boy, glowing with an unnatural light, was seen crying in the upstairs corridors, a spirit christened the Shining Boy. And a woman in a vibrant blue dress was occasionally glimpsed, her attire from a bygone era, moving silently through the ruined gardens after the fire. This proliferation is critically important to understanding the Borley phenomenon. It shows how a haunting can grow, not just in intensity, but in cast size, fed by expectation and collective storytelling. The Lonely Nun was a specific legend tied to the land, but once the house was declared haunted, it became a blank canvas. Every unexplained noise in the night, every shadow in the periphery, was filtered through that lens and given a form. A creak in the stable became a phantom coach. A misperception in the fog became a headless man. The haunting evolved from a singular, tragic tale into a general atmosphere where anything strange was possible, and every strange thing was catalogued as another resident ghost. This process reveals less about the supernatural and more about the human need to populate mystery, to give names and faces to the formless unease that a place like Borley Rectory so powerfully evokes. Perhaps the bricks and mortar of Borley Rectory were always part of the haunting. Beyond any ghost, the house itself was an unsettling place to live. Its design was famously awkward, a sprawling maze of more than 20 rooms connected by long, dark, and often windowless corridors. These passageways seemed to swallow light and sound, creating pockets of profound silence that would suddenly be broken by the echo of a distant footstep. The isolation was absolute, with the nearest village a mile away, leaving the rectory shrouded in the deep quiet of the Essex countryside. This environment was a perfect incubator for fear. The human mind, when deprived of normal sensory input and placed in confusing, shadowy spaces, begins to fill in the blanks. A creaking floorboard becomes a stealthy tread. A draft under a door feels like a cold, intelligent presence. The architecture didn't just house a haunting, it practically guaranteed that anyone living there, already aware of the stories, would interpret every ordinary noise and shadow as something extraordinary. This physical reality leads us to a compelling psychological theory about what might have been happening. Some researchers propose that Borley was not haunted by conscious spirits, but by what are sometimes called crisis apparitions or psychic imprints. The idea is that intense emotional trauma, like sudden death or profound grief, can somehow etch itself into the very fabric of a location, like an emotional recording. Under the right conditions of atmosphere and a receptive mind, this recording might play back. The phantom coach charging up the drive could be the psychic echo of a messenger bringing terrible news a century prior. The sad nun pacing the garden might not be a sentient ghost, but a repetitive loop of sorrow from a real historical tragedy, endlessly replayed. This theory elegantly sidesteps the question of intelligent ghosts, suggesting instead that the house was a vessel charged with the emotional residue of its long and likely turbulent past. It turns the haunting from an interactive drama into a tragic, automated replay. Yet this still leaves us with the most powerful force of all, human expectation. Once Harry Price branded Borley the most haunted house in England, its reputation became a self-fulfilling prophecy. The label acted like a filter, attracting a specific kind of occupant and visitor, people who were fascinated by the paranormal, who wanted to believe, or who were simply suggestible. They arrived with their minds primed to see a ghost. In such a state, the strange architecture and the oppressive silence did the rest, transforming vague sensations into concrete visions. The legend fed the experience, and the reported experiences, in turn, fed the legend, creating a feedback loop of fear that grew stronger with every retelling. So we are left with a tangle of possibilities. Was Borley Rectory a place of genuine paranormal activity, a reservoir of psychic trauma, or a masterclass in environmental psychology and mass suggestion? The truth may be the most haunting answer of all, that it was somehow all three, a perfect storm where a creepy house, a tragic legend, and human nature colluded to create a mystery that refuses to die. The transformation of Borley from local secret to national obsession happened with astonishing speed, and it had a very specific catalyst. For decades, the strange occurrences were confined to family conversations and village whispers, a classic piece of slow-burn English folklore. That all changed the moment the terrified Reverend Smith posted his letter to the Daily Mirror. The newspaper, one of Britain's largest and most popular, did not just report the story, they weaponized it. They dispatched a reporter to the rectory who, upon hearing the tales of phantom nuns and flying stones, immediately called in the era's most famous ghost hunter, Harry Price. This was not a search for truth, it was the launch of a spectacle. The Mirror's coverage was breathless, sensational, and perfectly timed for a public hungry for escapism in the uneasy years before the Second World War. Headlines screamed about the most haunted house in England, and each subsequent article treated every faint knock and cold draft as front-page news. This media frenzy did more than just spread the story, it actively reshaped the reality of Borley Rectory. The house was no longer a private home, it was a public attraction. Curiosity seekers began to arrive, peering over the garden wall, hoping for a glimpse of the supernatural. This constant outside attention created a pressure cooker atmosphere for anyone living inside. Imagine trying to discern a genuine strange sound when you know the entire country is watching and waiting for you to hear a ghost. The press coverage set an expectation, and for witnesses already on edge, it became a script. They were not just experiencing phenomena anymore, they were performing a role in a national drama. Their every sensation filtered through the lens of the headlines they had likely read themselves. In this way, Borley Rectory became one of the first great media hauntings of the modern age. The story was no longer owned by the people who lived it, it was owned by the narrative crafted in newsprint. The legend grew not organically from the ground up, but from the front page down, feeding on its own publicity until the line between what happened and what was reported to have happened became impossibly blurred. The power of the press proved to be a force far more tangible than any phantom nun, building a haunting in real time for an audience of millions. The fire did not end the story, and neither did the bulldozers. In 1944, the blackened skeleton of Borley Rectory was deemed a public hazard and finally torn down. The bricks were carted away, the cellars filled in. It seemed the landscape itself was being scrubbed clean of the haunting, but the land refused to be quiet. In the early 1950s, a new structure rose on the exact footprint of the old rectory, a modest modern bungalow built for a local farmer. It was a deliberate statement of normality, a simple home meant to erase the Gothic past. Yet almost immediately, the new occupants began to experience familiar troubles. They reported unexplained knocking sounds within the walls, objects that would vanish and reappear, and an overwhelming feeling of being watched in certain rooms. Most chillingly, several independent witnesses claimed to see the figure of the nun, not near the old summer house path, but now walking across the lawn of this new, ordinary house. It was as if the haunting was not tied to the Victorian architecture, but to the very soil beneath it. The ghost had outlived its original home. Modern visitors to the site, often paranormal enthusiasts armed with digital recorders and electromagnetic field meters, continue to report anomalies. They capture strange orbs of light in photographs taken in the garden, record disembodied whispers on audio, and speak of sudden, inexplicable drops in temperature as they walk the old carriage drive. The current residents of the bungalow have, for the most part, chosen to live quietly with this legacy, rarely speaking to the press, which in itself speaks volumes. Their privacy suggests a desire to avoid the circus that consumed the rectory's earlier inhabitants, but local law maintains that odd things still happen. This persistence forces a profound question: what is truly being haunted? If the phenomenon survived the total destruction of the original building and transferred to a new one, then the ghost is not in the walls, it is in the story itself. The legend of Borley Rectory has become a self-sustaining entity, a narrative so powerful that it now generates its own experiences. When someone stands on that ground knowing its infamous history, their mind is already primed. Every nighttime rustle in the hedge becomes a spectral nun, every house-settling creak a phantom footstep. The haunting has evolved from a series of reported events into a cultural echo, forever bouncing back from the landscape to anyone who listens for it. The most enduring spirit at Borley may not be a mournful nun from the 18th century, but the very idea of the place, an idea that proves to be utterly indestructible. A modern ghost hunting team arriving at the Borley site would operate in a world Harry Price could scarcely have imagined. Their equipment cases would hold not just notebooks, but an array of sleek digital devices, each designed to quantify the unseen. The backbone of their investigation would be the EMF meter, a handheld gadget that measures fluctuations in the local electromagnetic field. The theory, though hotly debated, suggests that spiritual presences might disrupt or draw upon electromagnetic energy, causing the meter's lights to flash and its needle to spike. They would conduct EVP sessions sitting in the quiet darkness with a high-sensitivity digital recorder, asking questions into the empty air, hoping to later analyze the audio for faint, unexplained voices hidden in the static. A thermal imaging camera would scan the rooms and gardens, looking for unexplained cold spots, sudden drafts of intense chill that some associate with a ghostly presence drawing energy from the environment. Their vigil would be structured and silent, a far cry from Price's dramatic seances, with team members stationed at fixed points, meticulously logging timestamps for every anomaly their instruments detect. What might this technology reveal at Borley today? It would almost certainly find something. The old site is crisscrossed with buried utility lines and subject to the natural electromagnetic fields of the Earth itself, which could trigger false positives on an EMF meter. The wind through the trees and distant road noise could easily produce ambiguous sounds on an audio recording. The thermal camera would undoubtedly capture cold spots because old foundations and damp soil naturally create variations in temperature. The crucial and often controversial step comes in interpretation. A modern team steeped in the legend would be predisposed to interpret any anomaly as evidence of the haunting. A spike on the meter at the site of the old summer house becomes the nun's energy. A faint whisper on the recorder might be heard as the word prayers. This is the double-edged sword of the technological approach. It gives a scientific veneer to deeply subjective experiences, transforming ambiguous data into personalized proof. The contrast with Harry Price's era could not be starker. Where Price was a showman who brought reporters and used planchettes to conjure stories, modern investigators present themselves as technicians using gadgets to collect data. Price sought a narrative, a dramatic story for the newspapers. Today's teams seek evidence, a graph or an audio file to be analyzed and shared online. Yet both approaches share a common vulnerability, the overwhelming power of human expectation. Price's observers saw what he trained them to see, and modern investigators often hear what the legend tells them to hear in the digital noise. The technology provides new ways to listen, but it cannot tell us what we are listening for. If the haunting of Borley is, at its core, a story woven from folklore, psychology, and place, then the most sensitive microphone in the world may only ever record the echo of our own belief. The human mind is a powerful instrument for making sense of the world, but it is also a masterful storyteller in the face of uncertainty. Psychology offers a compelling lens through which to view the Borley phenomena, not to dismiss the experiences of those who lived there, but to understand how they might have been constructed. Consider the sheer isolation of the place, a vast drafty house surrounded by empty fields, where the wind moaned in the chimneys and shadows pooled in long, dark corridors. This environment alone is a recipe for heightened anxiety. In such a setting, normal house noises, the creak of settling timber or the scuttle of a rodent in the walls, become ominous. The brain, wired to detect threat, begins to interpret these ambiguous stimuli as something intentional, something alive. This is where a concept like pareidolia comes into play, our innate tendency to perceive familiar patterns like faces or figures in random shapes or shadows. A glimpse of a garden statue through the evening mist could become the stooped form of a nun. A coat hanging on a door in a dim hallway might, for a split second, resolve into the shape of a man. The mind fills in the blanks, and at Borley, the blanks were everywhere. This individual suggestibility can be amplified dramatically within a close-knit group, especially a family under stress. The Foysters provide a fascinating case study. They moved into a house already infamous for being haunted, a label that primed them for fear from the very beginning. When one person, say Marianne, jumped at a strange sound and interpreted it as a supernatural event, that reaction would instantly infect the others. Lionel and their maid, sharing the same stressful environment and the same powerful narrative, would become hyper-vigilant, their perceptions aligning with her lead. This can spiral into a form of shared psychosis, sometimes called folie à deux, where the delusional beliefs of one person are gradually adopted by another in a closed, intense relationship. The phenomena at Borley were not experienced by solitary individuals in a vacuum. They were witnessed and reinforced within a small, pressurized social unit. A thrown bottle witnessed by 3 people becomes an incontrovertible fact, the shared experience cementing the reality of the haunting for everyone involved, regardless of its original cause. This is not to say the Foysters or the Bulls were lying. Mass hysteria is not about conscious fraud. It is about the unconscious, contagious spread of symptoms and beliefs. In an atmosphere thick with dread and expectation, a genuine feeling of nausea or a sudden chill can be interpreted as a spectral presence. If one person reports a phantom smell of perfume, others may soon detect it too, their brains conjuring the scent from sheer anticipation. The collective hallucination becomes their shared reality. The power of the Borley story itself acted as a script. Once you know the tale of the coach and horses, every distant rumble of thunder or cart on a far-off road is filtered through that story, becoming evidence of its truth. The psychological perspective does not empty Borley Rectory of its mystery. It simply relocates the source of the haunting from the bricks and mortar to the intricate, suggestible architecture of the human mind. It suggests that the most powerful ghost in that house may have been the one we all carry with us, the ghost of our own perception, endlessly shaping the shadows into stories. The story of Borley Rectory did not end with its ruins, it simply migrated into our collective imagination. Long after the last brick was cleared, the legend found a second, more permanent home in the heart of popular culture. Its transition from a local mystery to a national sensation made it irresistible fodder for storytellers. The first major adaptation arrived startlingly early in 1944, while the Second World War still raged. A low-budget British film titled The Ghosts of Borley Rectory brought the tale to the silver screen, dramatizing the experiences of the Bull and Foyster families with a suitably gothic flair. It was a sign of how deeply the story had already penetrated the public consciousness that a haunted house in Essex could compete for attention with the headlines from the front lines. In the decades that followed, Borley became a staple of television documentaries and horror anthologies, a case study revisited by every generation of paranormal investigators. Each retelling added a new layer of polish to the myth, cementing its details from the nun to the phantom coach into a familiar and chilling formula. This cultural recycling did something profound. It transformed Borley from a specific location into an archetype. The sprawling, isolated Victorian house, the tragic backstory, the escalating poltergeist activity, and the skeptical investigator drawn into a web of terror, this blueprint can be seen in countless stories that followed. When the Lutz family fled their new home in Amityville in the 1970s, citing a barrage of supernatural horrors, the public and the press immediately framed it through the lens of Borley, another true haunting with a family under siege. The rectory's structure provided a narrative checklist for modern paranormal claims. Its influence seeps into the very architecture of horror fiction and film. The concept of a house built on a site of ancient tragedy, its very foundations soaked in sorrow, is a direct descendant of the Borley template. You can see its shadow in the endless corridors of the Overlook Hotel in The Shining, a place that absorbs and reflects the madness of its inhabitants. You can feel its presence in modern horror video games where players explore derelict mansions, piecing together a tragic history through found notes and ghostly echoes. Borley taught storytellers that the most effective haunts are not just about jump scares, but about atmosphere, history, and the slow unraveling of a dark secret buried in the land itself. Its enduring legacy is not merely that it was haunted, but that it provided a masterclass in how to build a haunting, a lesson the horror genre has been studying ever since. The rectory may be gone, but its blueprint for fear is permanently etched into our culture, proving that sometimes a story can be far more indestructible than any ghost. Harry Price remains the most enigmatic figure in the entire Borley saga, a man whose shadow is as long as the rectory's own. To understand the haunting, you must first understand the ghost hunter, and the evidence paints two starkly different portraits. The first is of a pioneer, a man of his time who genuinely sought to bring order to the chaotic field of psychical research. For the late 19th and early 20th centuries, ghost stories were just that, stories, dismissed by science as superstition. Price positioned himself as a bridge. He used cameras, temperature gauges, and detailed logs during his Borley vigil, methods that were considered cutting-edge for paranormal investigation. He founded the National Laboratory of Psychical Research, aiming to test mediums and phenomena under controlled conditions. His book on Borley was packed with diagrams, photographs, and witness statements, presented with the sober tone of a scientific report. In this light, Price was a dedicated, if obsessive, researcher who gave a voice to the unexplained experiences of ordinary families like the Bulls and the Foysters, treating them with a seriousness they had never received before. He forced the academic world to at least look at the data, however skeptically. His flaw in this view was not malice, but an overwhelming passion that sometimes blinded him to his own biases. He wanted so desperately to prove the reality of the supernatural that he may have seen patterns where none existed, interpreting ambiguous events as clear proof. This is the portrait of Harry Price as a true believer, a flawed but earnest seeker of truth who elevated a local ghost story into a case study for the ages. The opposing portrait is far less forgiving. Here, Price is the ultimate showman, a master of publicity who understood that a good story was more valuable than a mundane truth. His background in stage magic is crucial, critics argue, not as a tool for detecting fraud, but as a blueprint for creating illusion. They point to the inconsistencies in his Borley reports, the way phenomena seemed to escalate dramatically whenever he or a reporter was present. The discovery of the nun's bones in the cellar is the prime exhibit for the prosecution. Skeptics maintain the fragments were animal bones, and that Price, who controlled every aspect of the dig, either knowingly misidentified them or planted them to create the perfect, tangible climax to his narrative. His year-long vigil is similarly scrutinized, his volunteer observers often young and impressionable students, not impartial scientists. The most damning charge is that Price did not just document the haunting of Borley Rectory, he actively authored it. By declaring it the most haunted house in England in the national press, he created a self-fulfilling prophecy. He provided the script, the nun, the coach, the headless man, and then invited suggestible people into an environment where every creak and shadow could be interpreted as a line from that script. In this view, Price was not a researcher but a director, and Borley was his greatest production, a gothic thriller played out in real time for a captivated public. His legacy, therefore, is not one of discovery but of deception, turning a few strange family anecdotes into a cultural myth that he personally profited from through book sales and fame. So where does the truth lie? It likely resides in the uncomfortable space between these two extremes. Harry Price was almost certainly not a simple charlatan, deliberately inventing every detail from thin air. The core experiences of the Bull family predated him, and the Foyster poltergeist activity was witnessed by many beyond his control. He had a genuine, lifelong fascination with the paranormal. Yet he was also a product of the new age of mass media, a man who knew how to craft a narrative that would sell newspapers and books. His great sin may have been a form of confirmation bias on a grand scale. He arrived at Borley wanting to find a spectacular haunting, and so he did, interpreting every anomaly as evidence, overlooking contradictory details, and perhaps in moments of high drama, subtly encouraging the phenomena he sought. He did not create the ghost of Borley Rectory from nothing, but he may have been the master sculptor who took the rough, raw clay of local rumor and family testimony and shaped it into the iconic, terrifying statue we recognize today. He is the enigmatic key to the mystery because he is the one who framed the question in the first place and then provided all the most compelling answers. To decide whether Borley was real, you must first decide what you believe about Harry Price, and that judgment may tell you more about your own beliefs in the unseen than it does about the long-vanished rectory. At the heart of this entire legend stands one figure, the Borley nun. She is the anchor of the haunting, the spirit whose story was told and retold until it became the foundational myth of the rectory. But where did her story truly come from? The tale most often repeated is a classic Gothic tragedy. Long before the rectory was built, a Benedictine monastery was said to have stood on the grounds. A monk from this monastery and a nun from a nearby convent fell into a forbidden romance. Their desperate plan to elope ended in disaster. According to the most popular version, the lovers were caught. The nun faced a horrific punishment, being walled up alive within the convent walls, her spirit forever bound to the land where she met her cruel end. It is a perfect, poignant ghost story, rich with medieval imagery of forbidden love and brutal justice. But this version has a significant problem. There is no historical evidence for a monastery or a convent ever existing in Borley. No ruins, no church records, no mention in local archives. It appears this entire narrative is pure folklore, a story that likely attached itself to the area long before the rectory was even a sketch on an architect's plan. Yet there is another, more specific origin story that emerged later. This one centers on a woman named Marie Lara. She was said to be a young French nun from the convent of La Trace in Paris, who came to England in the 17th century to marry a wealthy Englishman from Borley Hall, the manor house that preceded the rectory. The story goes that her new husband, perhaps filled with regret or rage, murdered her shortly after their marriage and buried her body on the grounds. This account feels more grounded, providing a name, a nationality, and a specific location, Borley Hall. Researchers, most notably Harry Price himself, tried desperately to find records of Marie Lara. He claimed to have traced her to the French convent, but independent investigations have never verified her existence. No marriage records, no death certificates, no parish entries have ever been found to confirm that a French nun named Marie Lara lived, died, or was murdered at Borley. The historical trail for both tales runs cold, so we are left with a fascinating puzzle. The most famous ghost in England's most haunted house seems to have no verifiable history. This absence is itself deeply revealing. It suggests that the nun is not a historical personage who became a ghost, but rather a spectral archetype who collected a history. She is a blank canvas, a figure in a dark habit, onto which generations could project their own stories of tragedy and loss. The medieval romance speaks to ancient fears of punishment and lost love. The tale of Marie Lara reflects more modern anxieties about betrayal and violence within the home. The nun's power comes not from her biography, but from her symbolism. She is sorrow itself given form. This makes her the perfect central character for a haunting that grew and changed with every telling, a ghost whose story was always whatever the listener needed it to be. The search for proof at Borley Rectory went far beyond whispered stories, reaching for evidence you could see and touch. Photographs and physical objects became the battleground where believers and skeptics fought to define the haunting. Among the most famous images is the phantom brick photograph. Taken during one of Harry Price's vigils in the ruins, it shows a single brick suspended in mid-air against a dark doorway. Price presented it as startling evidence of telekinesis, a physical object moved by an unseen force. Skeptics, however, offered a far simpler explanation. They argued it was a classic double exposure, a trick as old as photography itself, where the image of a brick held in someone's hand was accidentally superimposed onto the background. Without the original negative for modern analysis, the photograph remains an intriguing but ultimately inconclusive artifact, a Rorschach test where viewers see either a miracle or a mistake. Then there are the disputed pictures of the nun herself. Several blurry, shadowy photographs exist, often taken through windows or in dim gardens, purportedly showing a tall, dark figure. Critics dismiss these as pareidolia in photographic form, the mind interpreting random shadows, tree branches, or even a trick of the light as a human shape. They point out that in an era of long exposure times and primitive cameras, any slight movement could create a ghostly smear. Believers counter that multiple independent witnesses describe the same specific figure, and these photographs, however imperfect, captured something that aligned perfectly with those consistent testimonies. The images are not clear proof, but they are echoes, faint traces of a presence that so many claim to see. The artifacts from Borley carry a similar weight of ambiguity. Take the glass candlestick that reportedly materialized mid-air and struck Lionel Foyster. For believers, this was a classic apport, an object moved through paranormal means. Skeptics asked a practical question: could it have been thrown by a human hand, perhaps during a moment of tension or unseen stress within the household? The written messages scrawled on the walls presented another puzzle. While the SPR report pointed to Marion Foyster as the likely author, the context remains haunting. If she did write them, were they a conscious fraud or the desperate, unconscious cries of a woman cracking under the strain of a haunted existence? Even as a human artifact, they speak to a profound trauma within those walls. Finally, the nun's bones themselves represent the ultimate contested relic. Harry Price's team declared them human, the tragic remains of Marie Lara. The skeptical investigators declared them animal, likely from a butchered pig. Modern analysis is impossible as the bones were buried in consecrated ground. This means the single most concrete piece of evidence is forever beyond the reach of definitive science, locked in a grave of its own controversy. This is the core of the Borley dilemma. Every piece of physical evidence exists in a state of permanent maybe. The photographs are blurry, the artifacts have mundane explanations, and the most dramatic find is shrouded in conflicting claims. For a skeptic, this ambiguity is the whole point. It reveals a haunting built on wishful thinking and optical illusions, where nothing ever quite solidifies into proof. For a believer, this same ambiguity is the signature of the paranormal, which by its very nature seems to dance just beyond the reach of conclusive capture. The ghosts, they might argue, do not perform on command for clean laboratory conditions. They manifest in the uncertain edges of perception, in the blur of an old photo, in the chill of a draft, in the stories that outlast the stones. The evidence does not solve the mystery of Borley Rectory. It simply holds the door open, allowing the legend and the debate to walk through forever. Borley Rectory was not alone in its infamy. Across the world, other houses have earned similarly terrifying reputations, yet each tells a different story about fear and belief. In the United States, the Amityville Horror captured the public imagination with a tale of demonic possession and a family fleeing in the night, a story fueled by a single, sensational book and subsequent films. In Australia, the Monte Cristo homestead in Junee speaks of cruel owners and tragic servants, its hauntings rooted in documented historical cruelty. And beneath the ancient streets of Edinburgh, the city's vaults are said to echo with the despair of centuries of poverty and crime. These places share a common language of dread, but Borley stands apart in a crucial way. Its haunting was not a single, explosive event, but a slow, persistent drip of phenomena witnessed over 80 years by multiple, unconnected families, from the Bulls to the Foysters to the Smiths. While Amityville's story rests largely on one family's account and has been widely challenged in court, Borley's legend is built upon a sprawling archive of personal diaries, newspaper reports, and the detailed, if flawed, investigations of Harry Price. It presents not a lone testimony, but a chorus of voices from different eras, all singing variations on the same eerie song. This cumulative weight of witness spanning generations gives Borley its unique staying power. It is less a ghost story and more a decades-long case file, a puzzle where every piece, from a child's account in the 1890s to a reporter's note in the 1930s, fits into a larger, unsettling picture. The haunting did not belong to one person or one moment. It seemed to be a permanent feature of the address itself, witnessed by vicars, captains, and children alike. That persistent, cross-generational echo is what truly cemented its title, making it not just a haunted house, but a sustained experiment in the supernatural, observed by an ever-changing cast of characters who all arrived at the same terrifying conclusion. Borley Rectory endures because it is not merely a ghost story. It is the ghost story, a perfect alchemy of every element that makes a haunting unforgettable. The setting itself was a character, a sprawling, isolated Victorian rectory straight from a Gothic novel, its dark corridors and empty rooms a blank canvas for fear. Into this atmosphere flowed a timeless tragic love story, the doomed nun and her monk, a narrative of heartbreak that resonates across centuries. Then came the people, a cast so compelling they seem scripted. The terrified, respectable families like the Bulls, the besieged and enigmatic Foysters, and towering above them all, the charismatic showman Harry Price, a figure both pioneer and provocateur. Each person who touched Borley added a layer of human drama, from private terror to public spectacle. The plot then delivered a climax of biblical proportions, a roaring fire that consumed the physical house but burned the image of a phantom nun in a blazing window into the public mind forever. And finally, the enduring debate, the fierce, unresolved argument between believers armed with personal testimony and skeptics armed with forensic critique. This is why Borley captivates. It offers every possible flavor of the supernatural mystery. If you want a classic Gothic atmosphere, it provides the creaking floorboards and the lonely moors. If you seek human psychology, it presents the fraught dynamics of the Foyster household. If you demand investigation, it gives you the flawed but fascinating work of Harry Price. If you crave a dramatic ending, it delivers the fire, and if you need a puzzle, it presents a century of evidence where nothing is ever quite proven or disproven. Borley succeeded because it blurred the line between fact and folklore so completely that the two became inseparable. The story fed the experiences, and the experiences fed the story, in a loop that has now outlived the house, the witnesses, and even the ghost hunter. It stands as a monument to our collective need for mystery, a perfectly constructed tale where the question is always more satisfying than any answer could ever be. The road to Borley today is a quiet country lane, leading you through the same flat, misty Essex landscape that has always cradled the legend. If you were to make the pilgrimage, you would find no Gothic silhouette against the sky. The rectory itself is long gone. What remains is a profound and ordinary silence. On the exact footprint of the infamous house now stands a modest private bungalow, its neat garden a stark contrast to the sprawling terror of the past. The current residents value their privacy, a quiet plea for peace after decades of intrusion, and their home should be observed only from a respectful distance. Your eyes would be drawn instead to the low, crumbling red brick walls that still trace the old rectory garden boundaries. These weathered walls are the most tangible relic, the very stones that once enclosed the phantom nun's walking path. To run a hand along their rough surface is to touch the only physical architecture of the haunting that survives. Just across the lane stands the ancient parish church of Borley, its graveyard a tapestry of moss-covered headstones. This churchyard holds two key pieces of the puzzle. First, it is the final resting place of many who lived the story, including members of the Bull family. Their graves are a silent testament to the ordinary lives that became entwined with the extraordinary. More famously, a short drive away in the churchyard at Liston, a simple grave marker bears the inscription, "The Borley Nun." Here in 1945, the bone fragments unearthed by Harry Price were laid to rest in a final act of attempted exorcism. The grave is often marked by small tokens left by visitors, a coin, a faded flower, a note, evidence that the story still compels a journey. For any intrepid viewer feeling the pull to visit, the experience is now one of atmosphere and imagination, not spectacle. You must come with respect for the land, for the current residents who call it home, and for the history itself. There are no tours, no gift shops, no guaranteed chills. The pilgrimage is a personal one. You stand on the quiet lane, you look at the garden walls and the empty space they define, and you listen. You listen to the wind in the trees, the same wind that once carried the sound of a phantom coach. You feel the weight of the stories that have been told and retold, and you decide for yourself what lingers in that quiet English air. The haunting, it seems, has retreated from the physical world back into the realm of pure story, waiting for each new visitor to bring it, however briefly, back to life. The epic saga of Borley Rectory is a journey through shadow and belief. It began as a quiet family secret in a lonely Essex rectory, where children saw a nun in the garden and heard footsteps in empty halls. It escalated into a national sensation under the dazzling, controversial spotlight of Harry Price, who catalogued phantom coaches and headless men. It reached its crescendo in the roar of a fire that burned the house to the ground, yet seemed to sear the ghost story permanently into history. For decades, investigators and skeptics have sifted through the ashes, one side presenting diaries and bone fragments, the other exposing flawed methods and human frailty. So what are we left with? Was this a genuine paranormal hotspot, a place where the veil between worlds grew thin? or was it a colossal, century-long hoax orchestrated by a showman and perpetuated by frightened, suggestible people? The most compelling answer may lie in the murky middle ground. Borley Rectory was likely a perfect storm, a complex alchemy of eerie architecture, powerful local folklore, and the profound suggestibility of the human mind under stress. It was a place where a creaking floorboard could become a footstep, a shadow could become a nun, and a shared story could become a shared reality. The haunting was woven from equal parts unexplained event, psychological expectation, and sheer, irresistible narrative. Its true legacy is not a solved case, but an enduring question, one that lingers like mist over those empty Essex fields. Do ghosts truly haunt places, or is it the stories we tell about them that give a haunting its power, its shape, and its terrifying eternal life? We would love to hear your theories in the comments below. Do you believe the rectory was genuinely haunted, or was it a masterpiece of human imagination? For more journeys into history's greatest mysteries, be sure to subscribe.